Speed. Marker. And action.
This podcast is being recorded at the Motion Picture Institute, the oldest film school in Michigan, training the next generation of filmmakers today. Check out the website motionpicture.edu and schedule a tour now. All right, guys, welcome to the podcast. Today, I have a very, very exciting guest, someone I've been dying to have on the show to talk to, a very, very good friend of mine and a veteran projectionist, starting off in 35 millimeter projection, then progressing to the big bad boy of them all, the apex IMAX film, 1570. It is a pleasure to have him here today. He's going to walk us through his experience as a projectionist. It is a wonderful story, starting off in 1999 with the IMAX at the Henry Ford, which you were the head projectionist up until 2016. And yeah, so without further ado, let's jump straight into the story. Let's talk motion picture. Ron, it is exciting to have you here, sir.
Thank you very much, Keanu. It's a pleasure to be here.
I guess there's so much to cover with the technology and what it's become and how popular it is right now. Give us the simplest breakdown of what IMAX is, just for the average listener listening.
Well, IMAX is, of course, a registered trademark brand name, and it's an acronym of two words, image and maximum. So they took the I from the word image and then the first three letters from the word maximum. And it refers to the size of the film frame, which is the classic 1570, 15 perforation, 70 millimeter film frame. The four original founders of IMAX who invented the projection technology and the 1570 film format wanted to come up with a unique name that would explain the technology and also something that people would remember. And and they're very protective of the brand still to this day. It has been attempted to be copied before with similar sounding names like iWorks and IMAX and some of these other names. But when you say IMAX, especially now, people know what it means. They know what the experience is.
And not everyone knows it's a Canadian company, right?
Correct.
Yeah, it started off in Canada, which I think is so fascinating that you said yourself, there's 4 college students who want to just dive into film technology and then also want to create the most immersive film experience possible. For a lot of people who don't know, and you have a wonderful piece of film here that shows the different scales, which we will have a close-up for everyone to take a look at. There is the 35, then there is the 70, and then there is the IMAX 1570, and that 15 is 15 perfs.
Correct.
So an average 35 millimeter piece of film, which one frame, it's roughly around about the size of a 25-cent $quarter.
The picture area, yes.
The picture area. Now, just to give people an idea of size, now how does that scale up when you get to a 1570 piece of IMAX?
Well, 35 millimeters 4 perf. Standard 70 is 5 perf. And 1570 is 15 perf. So 1570 is 3 times the size of standard 70 and 10 times the size, about 10 times the size of 35. You can fit about 10 frames of 35 millimeter film into the space of one frame of IMAX 1570. And then three frames of standard 70. A lot of times people confuse 70 millimeter and IMAX 70 millimeter. They're two different formats. Widescreen 70 back in the day with films like Lawrence of Arabia and Wizard of Oz and all those epics, Ben-Hur and that was 570, 5 perf 70 millimeter, which is still being used. Quentin Tarantino used it for The Hateful Eight, and there's still Nope was on 70 millimeter. So there's still a pretty large infrastructure out there of cameras and projectors for standard 70, not so much anymore for 1570. It's become a more rare, unique medium from just not that many years ago, actually.
And give people an idea of what kind of resolution they're looking at if they go see a true IMAX film projection.
Yeah. It's about 16K.
16K quality.
Native IMAX 2D. That's assuming that the image was shot in native 1570 with the IMAX camera.
Film cameras.
Correct. Not converted through IMAX's DMR process, not shot a different way in up-res, they're converted, and not shot with digital cameras. So the native 1570, as shot with the IMAX camera, is about 16K resolution. And when you watch some of these documentaries that have been shot that way, it's so clear you can count the number of eyebrows on somebody's face. It's lashes.
It's immersive.
Yeah, very clear.
So it's amazing because what most people don't know is your average film projection at a multiplex digital projection. The projectors are capable of 4K.
Right.
Most of them. However, the film feature files, the DCPs that they receive, are only 2K.
Most of them are.
Most of them are 2K. So people think you can actually get higher resolution at home on TV, which is so interesting. And then you don't understand how much you've lost until you have the joy of going to see an IMAX film in person, and then you are able to count all the eyebrows, see the pores, and you're like, wow, this is insane detail.
And especially at a so-called classic IMAX theater, one that was constructed and designed from the ground up, not one of the newer retrofits in the multiplex setting. I mean, those are a version of the IMAX experience, but they're not to be considered the same as, for example, these classic large theaters that were showing Oppenheimer last summer. And that's how most of them were, back in the years before IMAX became partnered with Hollywood for feature releases. They were all classic IMAX theaters found in the nonprofit standalone institutional setting. So museums, science centers, aquariums, those are where it all began.
And I'd love to know more about that, because you did say it started in the, in terms of education sector. It was all about research purposes, because the reason they developed IMAX film was to take the audience to places they could never go, or could possibly never go.
Right.
And that is like, space, the ocean, top of Mount Everest. What was the first true big IMAX documentary of that education type filmography that really caught wind?
It was a film called To Fly, which was done by McGillivray Freeman Films of Laguna Beach, California, that has a huge library of IMAX documentary films. That To Fly came out in 1976, and it premiered at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. And it was all about flying, essentially, different forms of flying, aircraft, gliders, hot air balloons, So they took the camera up there, and it's, you get the you are there experience. And that was what the four high school buddies in Toronto wanted to do, because in the late 60s, you had a exhibition projection technology called Cinerama, which was 3 different projectors synced together, projecting on 3 different screens. And it was a cool experience, but it was very cumbersome, very costly, clunky, and cumbersome. And these guys got together and it's like, well, we're going to make a film format that will do the same thing, essentially, but with one large piece of film and one projector.
And that's why it's so, I think for the audience at home to understand, people listening, how significant IMAX is for the experience. It is the size. The screen is bigger, right? You're dealing with so much more real estate for picture. You just find yourself almost living in the image. It feels more like a window than a frame. And, I think that's why a lot of people don't understand is when they see this whole new trend of adapted for IMAX or anything like that, or remastered for IMAX, which they're doing with a lot of modern films. They're shooting on digital IMAX cameras, so they're not making true IMAX. But when you shoot on true IMAX film and you get the 1570 print, that frame is so much bigger, it blows up with so much more high quality, and it just immerses you. So you're saying To Fly was the first documentary to really catch them. And then from there, when did they open their first location in the States?
In the United States, the first permanent IMAX theater was of the dome type. At the time, it was called OmniMax, the prefix omni, meaning all around you. Later, they changed the term to IMAX Dome. But it was an IMAX Dome or OmniMax Theater at the Reuben H. Fleet Science Center in San Diego, California.
Can you explain what a dome IMAX theater is compared to a regular one?
Well, most people, if you say, they know what, like, for example, what a planetarium is. But when you go to a planetarium, you know, it's mostly for astronomy-related stuff or laser shows and that kind of content. And the image is projected all around a dome screen, completely around. In an IMAX Dome theater, you've got a dome that's tilted on an angle, and then the front 83% of that surface is projected with a fisheye lens. And the IMAX Dome experience was fantastic for like the outer space documentary films, the underwater documentary films, because you would be sitting in the chair, leaning back slightly like this, looking straight up and then to the left and to the right, you know. So it really gave you the you are there experience, whether it was one of the space shuttle films or the numerous underwater films that are, you know, fish swimming by, your sensation behind, you know. That's what the four guys wanted to do.
But it's also a dome is not a screen, right? It's a bunch of
made
panels.
up of individual panels that are affixed to a metal framework behind it. The first IMAX domes, you used to be able to see the seams between the dome panels because they were riveted on the frame behind. But the more modern domes, especially the planetariums, they have they're called nano seam, and you can't see the seams anymore. But when the image was projected, especially if it was a light scene, you could see the seams in between those panels. But not so much anymore. They've perfected that.
So what came first? Was it regular IMAX or the dome?
Regular IMAX came first. The first permanent flat screen IMAX theater opened at the Cinesphere in Toronto in 1971.
And then how far until they came up with the dome technology?
Pretty much around the same time. The dome was just essentially the sister system to the flat screen 2D. It was the same 1570 film, the same rolling loop projector, but just with a fisheye lens on it for the curvature of the screen. And then the film frame for an IMAX Dome customized print was cropped at the corners.
So it's like a different kind of immersion, like you're saying, because it's all around you, essentially.
And that immersion, like I said, worked great for certain films. The underwater films, the space films, not so much for Hollywood content because the edges would be cut off, but the corners rather would be slightly cropped.
This is something we've spoken about at great length, and that is IMAX had a really extensive film portfolio in the education sector way before the Hollywood came knocking and that whole situation started. What was the first narrative film that IMAX put out that really got people's attention? And then how long until that led to our Hollywood rendezvous?
The first blockbuster, immensely popular?
No, I think it was like a short film. You said IMAX showcased like footage of there, like it was like a short film. It was like 8 minutes or something.
Yeah, it was called Tiger Child, and that was like a montage of kind of like a Everything Everywhere All at Once kind of montage of stuff when IMAX made its debut to the public at Expo 67.
So this is before they even did To Fly.
Oh, yes.
So when IMAX first came out, the first thing they put out to the public was at this convention?
At the Expo 67 in Montreal.
And it was an 8-minute short film of just
It was about
footage.
8 minutes, yeah. It was more or less a demonstration of the 1570 medium and the rolling loop projector.
Oh, I see.
Expo 67 in Montreal. And from there, they developed it into a theater technology that could be permanently installed in these custom-built facilities. Custom-built in terms of the physical design of the theater itself and the projection system that would be installed. All the classic IMAX theaters, when you look at them, when you look at pictures of them, they're all very architectural masterpieces from the outside. When you like, for example, the BFI Theater in London, beautiful building from the outside, and you know that's something special inside of it. The smaller IMAX theaters in the multiplex setting, you really can't get a whole sense of what it's about from looking on the outside of the building. But you know, the Cinesphere in Toronto is this big globe thing, kind of like Epcot Center at Disney. You know, and it's cool from the outside. You know, and you know something special is in there. So once, you know, IMAX became mainstream, then you saw more theaters being built.
Well, I want to dive into before they're mainstream. You said they did a lot of documentaries. So how many years of the documentary film side in nonprofit organizations and museums, how long did that last for? And what is like some, you know, highs and lows of that entire? Because that was a lot of your experience when you started with IMAX.
Well, it's still going on now. I mean, there's still IMAX theaters in institutional settings. But prior to the IMAX becoming involved in Hollywood, the heyday years of, you know, IMAX documentary films, I'd say, were the late 70s to the late 90s. It's about a 20-year period there.
And that was just documentary filmmaking. So for people who don't know, who never had the opportunity or the pleasure to go to an IMAX institution at like the Henry Ford or any other Indiana State Museum, you name it, these were just films like, was it one like Top of Everest? Was that one of them?
A film called Everest that was also done by McGillivray Freeman Films, the same company that did To Fly. There was that storm on Mount Everest, that very famous storm that books have been written about where some of the climbers lost their lives. That happened in 96, I think. And 2 years later, in 98, they did this film on Everest. And they built a special, customized, lighter weight IMAX film camera, took it to the top of the summit.
That's so cool.
And talk about a you are there moment. I mean, they trained the Sherpas, the Nepalese Sherpas who assist the climbers, how to use these cameras. And, you know, so they're shooting the guys walking on the summit of Mount Everest, and you feel like you're there. And it was a hugely successful documentary film, hugely successful.
I mean, that's something I love about this early stage of IMAX is, you know, you told me that IMAX would do these incredible documentaries. Well, not even IMAX. Let's give credit to the right people. It was how do I pronounce his last name?
Greg McGillivray.
Greg McGillivray. He's the one responsible for Everest and a lot of these popular documentaries. And his company was called
McGillivray Freeman Films.
Yeah, and they
based in Laguna Beach, California.
And these guys are responsible for these amazing feats. And what they
So
would
many
do,
of them.
they would train the people who were in those environments
Yes.
to be like the cinematographers and the camera operators,
Yep.
which is so cool because I think for anyone out there who wants to get into filmmaking and doesn't know how, I mean, take confidence from this story. I think my favorite one, and I think it's actually right in front of me right now. You told me about and you showed me an IMAX documentary where they went to space and they took the IMAX camera to space. Now, anyone looking at that would assume the camera crew was on that shuttle. That's not the case. They trained the astronauts
Yes.
how to use, load, unload, right, and operate an IMAX camera. And they had to do that on the ground, get them ready to use it, not only just to operate the machinery, but to operate it in zero gravity and then present beautiful images. And they even I think you showed me, they attached it to an arm, a mechanical
The
arm.
space shuttle arm.
Put it in space so they could get shots of the space shuttle and exterior. And guys, if you love science fiction movies and you love those kind of visual effects that they do, once you see these shots of real space shuttle on IMAX, you can watch it on YouTube. You showed it to me. I'll put the link in the description as well. It's so spectacular. And what an interesting thing for IMAX to do. What a wonderful way of them to just expand the medium. And I guess I want to hear more about that. What is the name of that film?
It was actually most people, if you ask them what was the first IMAX film you ever saw, whether it was Hollywood film or a documentary film, most people will remember their first introduction to an IMAX experience. And mine was in 1995 at an IMAX Dome theater at a science center in Tampa, Florida. It's no longer there. But the film was called Destiny in Space.
Destiny in
And it
Space.
was about the creation and launch, essentially, of the Hubble Space Telescope. Was a large part of it that was covered in that film. And the opening shot that you were referring to was they put the IMAX camera right there on the space shuttle launching pad at night, not during the daytime, right up close as it could possibly be. I mean, and the shuttle blasts off, and you feel as like you were right there, and the whole theater is rumbling and vibrating, and it is just a spectacular shot and a perfect introduction to that film. I should also mention many of the space films in the IMAX library were done by two very important people. Graham Ferguson, who was one of the 4 founders of IMAX, and his partner, filmmaker Tony Myers, who she was called the Queen of IMAX. And they're both sadly passed on now. But Tony and Graham partnered on a lot of IMAX documentary space films. Not only Destiny, but Space Station 3D and A Beautiful Planet and Blue Planet and Mission to Mir. I mean, there's a whole library of them that were enormously popular because they were very successful with both school groups, which visited these institutional theaters a lot for the IMAX documentary experience, matched with the curriculum that they were being taught in school, and the general public. Because, I mean, you know, where else can you get an experience of being there for the price of a movie ticket, you know? A film that was played a large part in my career that I was just reminded about last night with that Titanic program that was on ABC last night was called Titanica. So they took the IMAX camera down to the wreck. And instead of looking through a little window in a submersible, you feel as if you're walking on the floor of the ocean and the wreck is right there.
Wasn't that made by James Cameron?
No, not this one.
Really? Okay.
Titanic. It was made by Stephen Lowe, who is another Canadian IMAX film producer. He's based in Montreal. He's done a lot as well. I know him very well. One of my favorite IMAX filmmakers, actually. He's done a lot too, like Greg.
And I guess I think something people might want to know is all these incredible films, these incredible documentary films. I mean, they've put that camera, like we said, they put it in space. They put it at the top of Everest. They put it at the bottom of the ocean. Where do they get the funding to make these type of films?
For a lot of them, like, for example, with IMAX and the space films, they got sponsorships from NASA or Lockheed Martin or the National Science Foundation. You know, they would be production partners on the film and, of course, get credit and everything. But the reason they were interested in those films, because there was a very important aspect of the whole IMAX documentary era, which I refer to as lifelong learning. So you had, over the years and the decades, you had just thousands and thousands of school kids going to see these films, memorable experiences for them, and they leave the theater having learned something. Many things, but hopefully at least one thing that they remember for the rest of their lives. And as a projectionist, that was one of my favorite parts of the job, was showing these films to the school group kids and them really learning, you know, being entertained, of course, but going away having really learned something. And, you know, a lot of them get interested in science or astronomy or underwater exploration or take what have you as a result of having seen these films.
And I mean, you cannot downplay the impact these films can have on children because of how wonderful and spectacular the images are. And you had your experience where you were in Florida and you saw an IMAX film, but at the time you were already a projectionist. You were working in 35 millimeter, and I believe you told me when you got back to Michigan from Florida, you immediately went and tried to find your way into IMAX. What sparked that? What made you want to get involved?
I was a 35 millimeter projectionist at that point for 3 years. I knew what IMAX was, but I had never been to an IMAX theater. At that time, there weren't that many to be found. When I came back to Michigan after that vacation that summer of 95, the following spring in 1996, I went down to the then called Detroit Science Center, which has an IMAX Dome or OmniMax, and they were showing this Titanica documentary that I just mentioned. And I just went down there and talked to people and told them who I was, and I kind of had a dual interest there as a film projectionist and then a Titanic buff, geek, nerd, whatever you want to call it, since I was a very small boy. So not only was I interested in wanting to get my foot in the door with IMAX projection, but I wanted to show that film, that specific film, Titanica, which came out in 1991. Well, the expedition was done in 1991, and the film was released in 92.
So you started off in IMAX at that point. It was...
Spring of 96.
And it was the Detroit Science Center?
Yes.
And how long did you do IMAX projection there?
That was where I was initially trained, and I was there for 2.5 years. The job opening became available down south in Shreveport, Louisiana, for the launch and startup of a new IMAX Dome theater, same projection system that I had in Detroit, at a science center there. And I wanted to, by that point, I knew I wanted to make IMAX my career, and so I applied for the position, was offered the position, accepted it, and moved down there with the intention of staying there, long term. Ultimately, that's not what happened, but it was a great experience starting up a new theater. I learned a tremendous amount by just starting up this new theater. And I was there for about a year, and then I came back to Michigan when I found out about the construction of the
Henry Ford.
The then Henry Ford IMAX theater. Yeah.
And I guess that takes us into the real meat and bones of your story, because you started off. First off, a $17 million budget was what I believe you told me.
It cost them they paid about $17 million to construct it.
To construct. So the Henry Ford paid $17 million to construct an IMAX theater and their facilities at the museum. Mm-hmm. They were going to lease the equipment and the brand from IMAX to showcase IMAX films, and then they hired you and a crew to then man that system. So you were a very interesting, I would say, conveniently placed person, because you were not necessarily an employee of IMAX. So you guys were a customer of IMAX. And I think
right.
That's an interesting dynamic.
That's how the business model was. So, all these IMAX theaters that you found in the institutional setting were referred to as IMAX affiliates. Like, for example, WXYZ Channel 7 in Detroit is an ABC affiliate, okay? That's same kind of dynamic there. So these institutions paid to build a physical theater structure, but they licensed the technology and they licensed the brand in a lease model from IMAX Corporation. And that's still essentially how they do it today. There are a few IMAX theaters before they adapted the lease model that own their systems, own their projection systems. But that model was changed from a purchase model to a lease model very early on.
How long did it take to build the IMAX at the Henry Ford?
I think it was about 2 years.
And you were there for that whole process?
Most of it. It was well under construction when I started in the summer of 99. The exterior walls and that. The inside was not nearly done. Yeah, and the system wasn't installed.
You got to see them install the projector and raise the screen.
Yes.
Which, how big was that screen, Ron?
That screen then was 62 feet tall and 85 feet wide.
62 feet tall. 62 feet tall.
The native aspect, the native 1570 aspect ratio of 1:43 to 1.
At what distance?
You mean the throw distance?
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, sorry, we're projectionists. Not to not to flex. The throw distance is the distance from which the light leaves the lens and lands on the screen. That distance from lens to screen in a projector, in a projection auditorium. So what is that?
There it was about 79 feet.
So your light, just so people can really build this image in their mind, the light leaving the projector has to travel 79 feet and then take up a radius of 62 feet by, what is the width?
85.
Oh my goodness.
So then it uses xenon lamps, but very large xenon lamps that can project
I think it's time you should show us
bright
the
light
lamp.
at great distances.
Ron brought a little Easter egg today for anyone who's watching the video. He actually brought in an IMAX Xenon lamp.
This is an old degas lamp that was given to me.
Can you see that, Jay? Can I move the water bottle? Look how beautiful and massive this thing is. So what is the wattage on this?
15,000.
15,000 watts. If anyone is just listening, it is the size of an ostrich egg, right, Ron?
Yep, thereabouts.
Give you an idea of like my hand for distance. Oh my god, for size comparison. That is massive.
Xenon lamps are still used. Laser projection is out there now, but it hasn't completely taken over from xenon lamps. Xenon lamps are still used in digital projection today, but they're only a fraction of this size. Most in the multiplex setting, most xenon lamps are anywhere from 2,000 watts to about 6,500 watts, depending on some of the premium large format experiences use the larger lamp if they have a slightly larger screen. But
And
when you factor in the throw distance you mentioned, the size of the screen and the size of the film frame, at the brightness that is necessary for a true IMAX experience at 16K resolution, and I'm talking about 22-foot lamperts of brightness in this, as measured with a light meter in the center of the screen, this is a lamp that was required for that. In a 3D system, 2 lamps were used, one for each film print. But it's a xenon arc lamp, and it needs to be water and air cooled.
So
The larger the lamp, the more cooling it's required.
I want to do a whole dive into just how the cooling and all the mechanisms work. Just so anyone who knows, these lamps are very dangerous. This is a degassed lamp, correct?
Yes.
So this is actually not putting our lives at risk or anyone in the studio, in case anyone's wondering. I don't want to hear it in the comments. No, so it's so big and it's beautiful, and it is. I mean, I for myself, I deal with xenon lamps on the regular. Nothing as big as this. I think the biggest one we have is a 6,500 watts, which from 6,500 to 15,000.
That's less than half the size of this.
It's insane. So I definitely want you to pack it away.
A couple of other uses before I do that. Again, I talked about projecting bright light at great distances, and other than motion projecting, using it for IMAX 1570 projection, there are 2 other non-theatrical uses for this lamp that that were used. One was NASA used these lamps, not just one, but multiple lamps, to illuminate the space shuttle on the launching pad at night. Yes, because you're talking about having to light up this huge, space shuttle, bathe it in light at night, So they use multiple lamps of this type to do that. Of course, the space shuttle has been retired now, but another application that is still that these are still used for is illuminating Niagara Falls. At night.
That's actually really, really cool.
A big part of the experience of going to Niagara Falls is seeing the falls lit up at night, and they bathe them in different colors and that, and they use these lamps to do that because the falls, of course, are huge, and the light needs to travel a long way.
I think it's actually really cool, and it's I mean, for anyone who's watching the video, they can see it's so big. Like, it's just crazy. It's crazy how much engineering went into IMAX. And I think that takes me to...
Absolutely.
That's now where we're going to start our conversation about what the jump was like from 35 millimeter to 1570 IMAX. How was that jump for you, Ron?
I get asked that a lot, and the best way I can describe it is a lot of the basic principles are the same, between the various film formats. But the larger you go, the more things that are involved, the more ancillary systems that are involved, the more attention to detail that becomes necessary. The margin for error is reduced. So the way I explain it to people is, let's say you're a mechanic and you work on engines. It'd be like going from 35 to 1570 would be like tinkering with a lawnmower engine to being a mechanic for an 18-wheeler semi-truck engine.
It's a big jump.
Yeah. A lot of this the same. And in between, of course, you have 870 and 1070 and 570 and other systems. But it's a universal leap of technology from 35 to 1570 because you're talking about, the larger lamps that need to be air and water cooled. And there's a whole chiller system involved with that.
Break that down for us.
Well, the air-cooled lamps, all you need is an exhaust tube on the top of the lamp house with a fan sucking the hot air to the outside. The 15K lamps, the air cooling is not enough.
It's too hot.
Too hot. So they have a chiller system, a closed-loop chiller system that would use city water, chilled city water, to cool distilled water, a closed loop of distilled water, what would be pumped through the lamp at about 10 gallons per minute. So about 10 to 12 gallons per minute would be cycled through distilled water, cycled through the lamp. As the water went through the lamp, it would take on that heat and then in turn go through a heat exchanger and be chilled with chilled city water and then cycled back through the projection system. So that was a very important part of the 1570 system using the 15K lamp, because if the chiller system failed, the lamp overheated, the lamp goes out. So you had more opportunity for things to go wrong, potentially, with the 1570 system. But if you maintained everything and did everything right and didn't make any mistakes, very, very reliable system.
And I want to now take a second on the table. We've got some goodies here for us. This in particular, I want to see if we can show. Can I show people that real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this here is a roll, and it says full GC. What does GC stand for?
Green card.
Full green card.
So, like in the beginning of the trailer where you see the green screen that says the following preview has been approved, blah, blah, blah. That is a full green card.
And how long, like duration, how long is that clip?
This is about 4 or 5 seconds.
So,
no, maybe not. No, maybe 3 seconds or so.
This is, for everyone watching, this is 3 seconds. And it is, I want to say, 1/4 inch thick, right? Mm-hmm. And that is, again, 24 frames a second. If I was to expand 24 frames of IMAX...
It would be larger than you could outstretch your arms.
Yeah, and I'm a pretty short guy, so it's definitely...
Yeah.
Wow.
Longer than me, too.
So
at 24 frames per second, the film would be traveling through the projector at the rate of about 300 feet a minute.
So 300 feet a minute?
Yeah.
Wow.
A lot of some of the older marketing tactics they would use to give you the sense of the scale and the scope would, like, if you unravel this print, it's 7 miles long, something like that.
Well, yeah. So let's talk about that, because with Oppenheimer, which is now the big IMAX instigator in recent times, you and I and a friend had the luxury and the privilege to go visit the Indiana State Museum, which has a very similar setup and build to the Henry Ford before it was dismantled. And it's currently operated by a friend of yours who you trained.
Yes.
And his name is Wayne?
Wayne, yes. He was one of my assistant projectionists in the early years at the Henry Ford, and he moved to Indiana to take over that theater. I can't remember the exact year. But size-wise, in terms of seating capacity and screen size, that theater is very close. The only difference being, yes, it's in a museum setting, and the museum owns it, but it's managed directly by IMAX Corporation. So there where I talked about before, where the museum theaters were affiliates of IMAX, that was true, but there were a small handful of standalone commercial theaters that were either owned and operated by IMAX, or in some cases just operated but not owned.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, I mean, shout out to Wayne for the incredible work he does at the Indiana State Museum.
Yeah, it was a great experience there. And I think the marketing for Oppenheimer, if I remember, they said Oppenheimer being a longer film.
11 miles.
Yeah, 11 miles.
11 miles.
If you unspool the whole print.
Yeah, if you and I took two ends, the beginning and the end of Oppenheimer, and we walked in two different directions, we apparently would get 11 miles of distance before we felt that tug, which is insane. And they never actually did that, for anyone wondering. They never actually did that experiment. It's just based off maths. They just kind of...
Yeah, numbers. Because you know how many frames are in a second, and you know how many seconds are in a minute and how many minutes in an hour, so you just do the math based on the running time of the movie.
And also, Oppenheimer was an incredible opportunity for them to innovate again. They had to expand the
platter size.
You want to walk us through how they did that?
So to explain that, I should go back to the fall of 2002, when IMAX first became involved with Hollywood.
Please do.
So prior to September of 2002, there was essentially no Hollywood content involved with IMAX, with a couple of exceptions. They did Fantasia 2000 in 2000, Beauty and the Beast in 2002, and the re-edition of The Lion King in 2003. But those were exclusive releases, exclusive partnership between IMAX and Disney for those three films at institutional settings. The commercial multiplex IMAX theaters, those didn't start coming along until 2004. But going back to September of 2002, IMAX came up with this technology called DMR, which stood for Digital Media Remastering, where they could take any native film, any native Hollywood movie shot in 35 and up-convert it to IMAX. Not in the IMAX 1431 aspect ratio, but in terms of using the IMAX film frame with the letterboxed aspect ratio and a higher resolution. So they developed this DMR technology, and they needed to pick a film to test that technology, and a film that had already been released. And they chose Apollo 13 to do that, a film that was released in 1995. And the reason they chose Apollo 13 was twofold. One, it was based on a true historical event that actually happened. And two, it was had a whole space angle theme to it, which went along well with the IMAX space documentary films. So they released Apollo 13 in September of 2002 at the Air and Space Museum again, and everybody, Tom Hanks and everybody who was involved, Ron Howard, director, who was involved with Apollo 13 in 95, 7 years later, seeing it in IMAX, were just completely blown away by it. And that was the birth of IMAX's relationship with Hollywood, because it got the notice of the studios, it got the notice of big-name directors, and so from those small roots, the infrastructure grew in terms of content and theaters for the once institutional IMAX business model to adapt to the Hollywood business model, which was completely different. And then at the end of 2002, you had Star Wars Attack of the Clones. But at that time, getting back to the running time, the IMAX platter systems were, again, initially designed for these documentary films, which were only about 45 to 50 minutes long, less than an hour.
My goodness.
And the other reason for that is when they played these documentary films for school groups, they like to turn them on the hour. So like a typical schedule at a Science Center IMAX theater would be, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4. You had the documentary film starting every hour at the top of the hour. And that worked well with the school groups because you could have 2 or 3 school group shows in the morning and 3 different films. So the platter systems were initially designed to project films less than an hour.
And it gives you time to rethread.
Yes, which takes about 20 minutes for 2D. Then you had the special releases that I talked about, Fantasia, Beauty and the Beast, and The Lion King. Those were all longer films. Fantasia 2000 was the first film where IMAX, the engineers, had to go back to the drawing board and figure out a way to make these reel units. By the way, when I say reel unit, I mean individual reels of film spliced together on a metal disc or platter, not the old changeover method, that the Redford uses with 35.
Let's a quick little breakdown for anyone who doesn't know what that means. So the changeover, do you want to explain that real quick?
Before platter systems were invented.
Platter is that. I'll have pictures overlaid.
Yeah, a platter is a flat disc, a metal flat disc that turns and feeds the film to the projector from the center over to the projector, and then it sort of takes up on an empty platter. And it doesn't have to be rewound. The film kind of rewinds as it plays because it's fed from the center out towards the edge. But prior to the invention of platter systems in the 35 millimeter setting in the 70s, you had 2 35 millimeter projectors in any given projection booth, and the projectionist would project one reel on one projector and then change over to the next projector with the subsequent reel. So they were flipping back and forth between 2 projectors however many reels of film was, Then platter systems came along, and that allowed one projector to be used and all the reels to be spliced together and made up or wound onto a disc.
And splicing, for anyone who doesn't know, is when they take these multiple reels and then a projectionist would sit at
Physically splice
with a splicer and use what is the name of the tape that you guys used?
Film splicing tape.
Film splicing tape, and you guys would use that to then keep those prints.
There were 2
together.
methods of splicing. Before the tape splicers, there was ultrasonic splicing.
Ultrasonic splicing?
Yeah, where you had using electricity or essentially welding, the 2 joints would be melted together, essentially welded together.
My goodness.
Ultrasonically. The disadvantage to that is once you made a splice, you couldn't take it apart.
I was about to say.
So the tape splicers allowed the tape to be removed so that you could separate the splice. Or if you made a mistake, if you put the tape on wrong, you could peel it off and redo it. But the reels were spliced onto the platter. So in late 1999, they went back to the drawing board and figured out a way to make the reel units, the IMAX reel units, run 90 minutes. So they went from 60 minutes to 90 minutes at that point because Fantasia 2000 was about 92 minutes long.
Yeah, I was about to say.
And then they had to increase that again for Beauty and the Beast and Lion King. Those were all movies that were under 2 hours, I believe. When Apollo 13 came out in 95, it was over 2 hours, about 2 hours and 20 minutes. Likewise with Star Wars Attack of the Clones, which came out after Apollo 13. But at that point, the reel units could only run 2 hours. So what they had to do was essentially take 20 minutes, edit those films down by 20 minutes, which the audience did not like at all. So before getting into 2003, they had to go back yet again and figure out how to make it go from 2 hours to 2.5. Now, with the Christopher Nolan films, not only Oppenheimer, but most of his films before that were even longer. So you had you had the round platter with the film coming over the edge of it, and it would literally fall on the floor if it came too close to the edge, because the platters spin very fast during projection. So IMAX had to extend the width of the platter for Oppenheimer, and they did that by they created these curved nylon segments that went around the edge of the platter and were bolted underneath to increase the distance. Because Christopher Nolan didn't want to shorten the film.
Yeah, and I think you told me with the Titanic screening you guys did, they just had an intermission.
They had an intermission.
Because the film was like 3 hours.
3 hours and 14 minutes. There's no way they could make it run that long. So
and now fast forwarding till today, which that was, when did they do the IMAX screening for Titanic? It was 2012, right?
During the centennial anniversary year, but they only made 5 prints of that one because it was a $100,000 print, and
good going.
and because it was a re-release, the studios didn't make such a big hubbub. Studios generally don't like the practice of intermission because you can't fit as many shows in during the day.
But it's Titanic.
But it went fine. We had a 10-minute intermission in part 1 and part 2, and the cutoff point was right at the same as it was with the double VHS tape, where the guy goes to the captain, I believe or the captain goes to the owner of the White Star Line. You may get your headline. I think you may get your headlines, but that was the cutoff right there for part 1. And but the audience liked it. I mean, it gives you a chance to get up and relax.
Yeah, especially 3 hours.
Yeah.
But now fast forward to when you and I went to go see Oppenheimer. We had the special privilege of going to check out the projection booth. Thanks to your friend Wayne. And again, it was a wonderful experience. I'd never seen the unit in person. Unfortunately, our friendship really started after that career had concluded for you. But being in that space with you and seeing the machine come to life, the one thing that really left an impression on me, and it's something you always said, but having been in there in person, I got to experience, it feels alive. The machine feels like it's breathing. And we went in there when they were just ending the one showtime, right before our showtime began. So we got to see the projector in unit, and I have some footage. I'll overthrow this. We got to see the film run across the room. I think that's a very beautiful thing people don't know, is because a 35 millimeter projection, the print is all happening inside the projector, unless you had that cross projector system, which we're not going to get into. It's a little too much. But it was usually always happening inside the projector. Whereas with the IMAX, the print literally goes across the room. Like it almost looks like it's floating across.
Yeah, it could be every setup's a little different with the relationship of where the real unit is placed with respect to the projector, but generally they're quite a distance apart. The IMAX dome projectors, for example, are raised up high in the air in an elevator to get to the center point of the dome screen, and so the film goes up and over and down in a dome theater. Of course, then you need room because the IMAX projector moves back and forth from the projection port, so you can get around in the front to thread it, and we need working space around every piece of equipment. So yeah, the film travels through a series of rollers from the feed source, the real unit, over to the projector and back. The one thing you always had to be careful of, depending on how much space you had in your projection booth and how big it was, that you didn't, in the dark, run into the film. Literally just like run into it. I used to have those ticket barriers, those tension poles spread across. When the system was running, I would put it across one of those, you know what I'm talking about, the tension poles, to prevent you from accidentally walking into the film.
So, I mean, okay, now, again, back with Oppenheimer and how much innovation went into the IMAX system. He did not want, Christopher Nolan, the director, he did not want intermission.
Right.
So they again had to expand the platter, which we got to see. They actually had built an extension, which was really, really cool. I think what's the most surprising is how Oppenheimer really captured the imagination of modern day audiences. And it's something that I want your opinion on. Because what people don't know is when IMAX first started this whole love affair with Hollywood, it was like 2002, 2003, which catches a lot of people by surprise. Nolan didn't come along until 2008 with The Dark Knight, when he started splicing in his films IMAX action sequences,
Right.
which then made the Batman films spectacular, which then made your career spike. There was a huge spike in IMAX attendance and people wanting to see those films, and how that changed your career. And I guess I want to hear a little bit about that period of filmmaking, and then how when IMAX kind of dwindled and it wasn't getting the same numbers because they had interspersed all these digital IMAX locations, the appeal of the physical experience, it just kind of like withered. And now all of a sudden, because of Oppenheimer and all the press they did about the IMAX experience, it kind of just exploded again into our society.
What happened with, and I never thought this would happen, but what happened with Oppenheimer, by the way, Nolan was always a proponent of the IMAX experience, and he was always, wanting to have release prints for his films, and he was always pushing it all the way, back to Batman Begins. But what happened with Oppenheimer, there was this great awakening. It's the best way I can explain it, where through videos on YouTube, threads on Reddit, videos and threads on Facebook, people sharing their experience of where they went and what they thought of this, and other theaters doing behind-the-scenes videos on YouTube, kind of just woke everybody up. And it's like, wow, this is awesome. And then they're even more, blown away when they realize, well, this is how it was all the way back to the late 70s. But back then, you didn't have the YouTube videos and you didn't have all the social media aspect sharing of it. Projection booths were closed off to the public. They never got to see what went on in there unless, something went wrong with their presentation, and then they turn back around and look at the little window back there to see if there's somebody up there. Now they know for sure that there is, especially with IMAX 1570. There's someone up there all the time. But in combination with Nolan's following, his power in Hollywood, his presence, that everybody knows about, being a successful filmmaker, in combination with all these social media channels, is what really, after all these years, put 1570 right in the limelight. Whereas before, the fanboys understood it in that, but people really didn't know what the difference was, because you had IMAX going to the multiplex model in 2004. They came out with their first digital projector in 2008. And so the brand kind of got meshed together Diluted, yes. And not every IMAX experience is the same, okay? Just like a BMW 3 and 5 and 7 series, they're all BMW, but they're not the same vehicle.
They don't drive the same. No.
Right. So, that's what happened this time around with Oppenheimer. People understand what it's about, and that's why you saw people travel out of state and great long distance to go to find one of the 30 theaters that were showing it. Make no mistake, it's an expensive technology. It's not a convenient technology. And, digital allowed for cost savings on the exhibition and distribution models.
Yeah.
And more convenience.
I mean, just on the distribution model, what people don't understand is that before Hollywood came in with their financing, the way IMAX films found their money, like we were speaking about earlier, is because they had theaters that they could recoup a cost of a film, they would go to these institutions like National Geographic and so forth, and they would say, I have an idea for a documentary. This is something we want to do. We're really passionate. We have a great concept. We want to make a documentary film, but we have proof of distribution. We have the locations. We have the facilities.
Promissory notes from
correct
institutional theaters that would, include the film, that would license the film and
Yes.
show it a certain number of times on their schedule.
They would go to the theaters, and then the theaters would sign off and say, we would love to have this film for sure when it's done, when it's ready. And then that was enough to go get financing for these films. The Hollywood model was completely different, right? The Hollywood model was they already had the film financed. Now they're like kind of expecting the IMAX to like bend over, you know, knee and shoulder to showcase their films. And I guess that takes me into a really interesting stint of your career, and that is how much power and influence you had as an IMAX projectionist, especially at the Henry Ford, you know, the institution that it is. Do you care to tell us the Polar Express story and how that went and played out? I don't think people really understand, and maybe people locally who went to that theater and watched that film for the 11 years that you guys showcased it, I don't think they know how much influence their projectionist had on that whole process.
In 2004, November 2004, when Polar Express came out, it was a new animation technology that Hollywood was using, where the actors wore the suits with the sensors and everything like that. So when you watch Polar Express and you look at those child actors, and if you looked at them in the flesh at that time, even now as adults, they look like what you saw on screen. They look so realistic. I'll never forget that one scene where the opening scene where the little boy's lying in bed and he's sleeping and he opens his eyes. They're like deep blue eyes, you know, it looks so real, you know. And I remember that scene in particular because when he opens his eyes, the kids in the audience would go, ooh, you know, it was one of those IMAX ooh moments. And also what propelled Polar Express to the popularity that it was not only the unique animation aspect of it, but it was in 3D. It was the first, not documentary, but first mainstream Hollywood use of the power of the IMAX 3D technology. I'm talking about this
And
kind
you have
of
the
3D.
glasses here for us to see as well.
Yes. The sensation of 3D realism that makes you want to, you know, reach out and grab the snowflakes, you know, kind of experience that you got in Polar Express. We were showing it 6 times a day, and it was every show, every day, sold out for 99 shows in a row.
99 shows in a row.
I was
sold
hoping we
out.
would make 100, but 99 shows at 6 shows a day.
That is, I don't think, how many people, I mean, what is the seating capacity of the Henry Ford?
For 3D, the seating capacity is slightly less than 2D because the seats down in the front rows at the ends were not optimum viewing for 3D, so those were left out of the ticketing system. 3D, it was 410.
So 410 seats sold out 6 times a day, 99 days.
Yeah, do the math there.
That is, and I think you told me no other film reached that kind of sellout point.
The record holder before that was Fantasia 2000 because that was being played 5 times a day for 4 months straight. And it was a big risk because, let me just jump back for Fantasia for 1 second. When Disney made that deal with IMAX at the time, they wanted 100% show schedule. That means that the institutional theaters who were showing Fantasia 2000 couldn't have any documentary films on their schedule for 4 months. And a lot of them, you know, because this was untested and tried at the time, balked at that. Like, well, we got to have documentaries for our school crews. We can't just have Fantasia and nothing else. So a lot of them took a risk in showing it. And Henry Ford took a risk in showing it. But it was a massive success. I mean, after the 4-month run of that film, it was something like 250,000 people came through to see it.
But okay, so now tell me what happened. So you get the print, you do these 99 sold out shows in a row, 6 times a day, and then the studio reaches back. I was Warner Bros. And they're like, send the print back.
Well, typically, you know, there were some growing pains there between studio relationship with IMAX and projection booths and that. they were obviously had well-founded concerns of theft or piracy and whatnot. And after the initial holiday run of 2004 to 2005, it was so successful by that point, they knew it was going to come back for Christmas of 05 to 06. Nevertheless, Warner Brothers wanted to collect the prints, back in the warehouse in Hollywood for safekeeping out there. Well, the problem with that concern that I had with that was, okay, you got to take the print apart in several pieces, section, not reel by reel, but 4 large parts, because of the 2 prints for 3D, and ship it back in these crates, risk the print being damaged in shipment. But for me, my major concern was I was concerned about getting my same print back. So I had Polar Express print number 30. Every print had a number. I was worried that I would not get print number 30 back. I would get some other print.
Yeah, give us a quick idea.
Which might not be in a good condition.
But a quick idea, like how much time goes into splicing an IMAX print together?
Polar Express was 30 reels for each eye, so 60 reels total. And generally, I would splice the film at night and generally do about 17, 18 reels a night before I get tired.
You see? So, I mean, how many hours is that?
It was spread out amongst usually 3 nights. If I really needed to work under the gun, if the print was shipped late or something, and we had a deadline to meet, I could do it faster. But I would always like to space it out over 3 or 4 nights, which included test running the print.
But that's why I want to give people listening an idea, because they won't understand unless they've been a part of the process. Someone like Ron would put 3 to 4 nights of work, hours of carefully splicing together 30 reels of IMAX film to make up 1 hour and a half print of Polar Express.
Yeah.
And that's why you felt so protective over your print, because now that it gets shipped back to Hollywood, and then when it comes back, you might not get the same print back, and another print could be in a bad condition. It could be damaged or anything, faded.
The truth of the matter is, not all projectionists treated the prints the way they were supposed to be treated. Okay? I mean, if you are a vinyl lover, you know how vinyl should be treated. Don't touch the surface and keep it free of dust and dirt and all of that. Well, back in the day, people didn't toss records around and everything, and that's why you got all the pops and scratches. Same thing would happen with a film print if it wasn't taken care of. And I had to print when it was brand new, having put it together from brand new, and it was in perfect condition, like new condition, at the end of the first holiday run. And again, I was afraid I wouldn't get the same print back. So what I did was, I petitioned, IMAX to petition Warner Brothers, explain the situation. I said, here, look, your print's going to be perfectly safe, staying in my possession.
At the Henry Ford.
Nothing's going to happen to it. It's going to be locked in a cabinet, and there were only 5 people that had keys to that cabinet. So, once Warner Brothers understood that this was a secure, closed environment, and not unlike some of these multiplex projection booths where everybody has access and there's no security or anything going on. Once they understood that their print was going to be safe and they didn't have to worry about theft or piracy, and that, they relented and let me keep it. And that, second holiday release turned into 9 more years after that.
So yeah, I think that's one of my favorite stories you've shared with me, is you had that kind of influence. A couple emails back and forth with Warner Bros. And they relented and they realized that you were more than capable of protecting their film.
The challenge was getting them to understand.
But they did. And that's the
at the end of
part.
the day, they did.
And they understood that you're a professional and you respected the film. And you kept that print for 11 years.
All the way to the end, 2015.
Which just goes to speak about your remarkable career. And that takes me into another really, really cool story. And you can talk about it now because obviously the film has come out, but you were under NDA. And that is screening the dailies for Zack Snyder's Batman versus Superman.
One of the top top highlights of my 30-year career in projection was back in 2015 when the state of Michigan still had the film tax incentives for shooting major features in the greater Metro Detroit area. There was a studio in Pontiac, and Zack Snyder was shooting parts of the movie up in Pontiac in 1570. And he needed a projection system on which to screen the dailies. A flat screen projection system on which to screen the dailies in the Metro Detroit. And Henry Ford was the obvious choice because we were the only one. So he petitioned our sales team to get us to allow us to rent the theater space to him. And these were, again, dailies, so, silent footage and camera tests and everything. Like one of the scenes was Henry Cavill trying on the Superman costume.
Cool. That's so cool.
And, of course, it was this was after hours. We were closed. It was only Snyder and his production crew and myself and couple other my projections were in the booth, our security team. And we had to sign NDAs that we couldn't discuss what we saw, obviously, because the film hadn't been released yet. But being, I really felt like I was part of his production team. I guess I was, like part of his production team in getting that film to theaters. And he was just the greatest down-to-earth guy, Zack Snyder. It was just a joy to work with him. And he came back 4 different times. The last time was a screening of another film that you're going to ask me about, I think. But 3 different occasions screening dailies. And these were short, maybe 15 minutes a pop. But I would get the dailies sent from the lab in California, and they would be shipped under a code name, so nobody knew what was in there. And and then it was shipped down. So
it came straight from the lab.
It came straight from the lab. So I had to platter it up that night, test it, get it ready, and then immediately after he was done screening the dailies, I had to take it apart and send it right back, right away. I could not keep the film print of his dailies in the booth overnight.
And he visited
the studio
booth.
wouldn't allow that. And that was completely fine. Because, again, this was just a short, reel, not an entire.
But he also personally visited the booth, right?
He did. All 3 times, yeah.
And I think you told me a crazy story about him actually coming up to, in person, just holding the projector.
He walked to the front of it, and he put his hands on it, and he just stared at it for several seconds. And his production crew was also in the booth. He said, "Guys," this is Zach. He's like, "Guys, come over here. You got to look at this. You got to look at this." So he got his crew all standing in front of the projector where all the mechanical rotor and parts of it and the lenses and everything. He's like, "Guys, take a good look at this. It's all mechanical. It's all mechanical. Nothing digital whatsoever." And yeah,
I suppose this takes me to you knew this question was coming. Still, the story itself today blows my mind. Zack Snyder calls up his good buddy Christopher Nolan and says,
well, at the end of his time of shooting in Pontiac at the studio there, he wanted to do something fun and for his crew. And so he calls up Nolan and says, "Chris, can I borrow your print, your 1570 print of The Dark Knight? You're okay with just sending it to the theater out here? The guys will take care of it and, let them project it for me and my team." And he said, yeah. So they shipped his print from the warehouse to me, and I had to get it ready and platter it up and show it for Zach and his crew. That was one of the most nervous times that I was, because here I'm in the care of Nolan's personal 1570 Dark Knight print, and I didn't want anything, obviously, to go wrong. The only other time I was more nervous than that was opening day of the theater in '99 when I had the first audience in there.
So to give people an idea, your first show was in what year? Was 1999?
The theater opened initially as an IMAX theater in November 19th, 1999.
So yeah, 1999, you show your first film, and you were super nervous because you're like, I have to make sure this goes well. Yeah. It's our first time showing the public. And the only other time you were nervous was...
That nervous.
Was that nervous?
Yes.
When
I say that nervous, I mean I was literally pacing back and forth from one end of the booth
to the
other.
You know what the stakes are if you break Christopher Nolan's personal print of The Dark Knight.
And that again is getting back to when you asked me about the differences between 35 and 1570. It's like zero tolerance for error. Zero. If you make any mistake in any process of preparing or exhibiting a 1570 print or not maintaining the system correctly, any mistake, what's going to happen is the show is not going to run correctly as it should, or it's not going to run at all. And if it runs incorrectly, the result of that is usually print damage or damage to equipment. So we were always on our toes for that. And that's why we couldn't leave the room. We were always in there. I mean, we had a bathroom in there and everything. We couldn't leave the room. When that system was running, we couldn't leave the room. Except to, answer the door for deliveries or something. But
so I think we've covered so much ground, and we know. I guess my biggest takeaway from this episode, especially locally, I mean, if an international audience is to listen to this and grasp a different understanding or perspective about IMAX, that is a major takeaway, and I hope that's the case. But more so, I'm hoping our local audience understands exactly what we lost when the Henry Ford decided to take away the IMAX, the true IMAX, from their institution. What that loss was for our film community, our cinephile community, and just for people in general who will never have that experience here. I mean, the only IMAX experience you can get now is these mini-maxes or Limaxes, these digital IMAXes at the multiplexes, and they're nowhere near the quality or the size of the screen or anything like that. Also compounded, the only physical IMAX film projection experience you can get in Michigan now is like 3-4 hours away from Detroit. It's in Grand Rapids, and that's the Dome that's still out there.
The flat screen in Grand Rapids, yeah.
Because I mean, the Detroit Science Center, they don't have IMAX anymore.
Well, they do. They have the Dome system, but they only show the documentaries and maybe a couple times a day. They did show Oppenheimer because they were asked to do it, but their model really isn't set up to do Hollywood all the time kind of thing there.
Correct.
But there were several institutions, quite a few actually, that from a financial standpoint, from a programming standpoint, they just, their relationship with IMAX came to an end because they didn't want to continue to do the Hollywood model. They wanted to go off and be able to show all different kinds of content, not just what IMAX was putting out. And, the proliferation of more theaters in larger markets like Detroit or Chicago or any of those where you had the multiplex IMAXs popping up in the suburbs. Prior to this great awakening that I talked about with Oppenheimer, people would just go to their closest IMAX, not realizing that it wasn't the same experience. So there were many reasons involved, but it's like, the old saying goes, you don't know what you had until it's gone. But you can apply that, like when you hear people say, I wish I never got rid of that classic car I had, or I wish I never got rid of that monster 70s stereo receiver, because these are things that you can't buy anymore today.
Gone.
I mean, yeah, there's high-end stuff out there, but you got to search a lot harder for it. You can't walk into, I don't know, Walmart or whatever and buy, a plethora of vinyl. But see, that's coming back again. That's an example of analog technology that's coming back because people are realizing how good it was, and now it's getting this resurgence. But again, it's not convenient and it's more expensive, compared to, listening to music off iTunes or, whatever. But if you're an audiophile, you don't care about cost and convenience. You want to listen to your music. You want to purchase and consume and listen to your music the best way possible. And you don't care about spending $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 on a Macintosh home audio system that's going to last you, that you could pass on to your grandchildren because it's going to last that long and it won't become obsolete. But for the mainstream moviegoer who are not cinephiles, they just want to see the movie. But when you talk about fans, Christopher Nolan fans, and fans of other directors like Zack Snyder or Judd Apatow or Steven Spielberg or whoever, those are fanboys / cinephiles, and they want to see it the best way, and they'll drive to a different state or they'll pay a higher ticket price or whatever.
To see it the way the director intended it.
Exactly. So the transition of, in the early days of digital transition in the multiplex world, everybody thought that was being done because it was better. It was better, 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 better. That's not the underlying reason why it was done. It was done because it saved money
It was cost.
for everybody involved, and it was more convenience. And it looked good enough. Okay, it looked good enough.
Which, like we said, I mean, every basic multiplex only screens up to 2K. I think the only 4K copy I've had in the time I've been a projectionist was Avatar 2. That was the only one. That film was the only 4K copy we got.
Yeah, so James Cameron's another, proponent of technology. And then there's also another whole thing about high frame rate that some directors are getting.
That'll be a different
involved.
episode.
Yeah, but no, it's somebody asked. I think it was I saw a media story where somebody was run. How come there's not more IMAX film theater? I mean, there used to be a lot, but I can tell you there would be more if there were 10 Christopher Nolans. But he's only one man, a very great filmmaker, successful man, but he's only one person.
But Oppenheimer did incredibly well in film IMAX. We went to go see it.
It got noticed.
Our auditorium was packed, and it made. I mean, not only did Oppenheimer make almost $1 billion, a significant portion of its its profits came from IMAX film projection, which I'm hoping, and I think you are too, that the Hollywood machine is going to see that and go for it. I mean, by the time this episode comes out, they're going to be doing the rollout of Dune 2. Now, Dune 2 was shot on digital IMAX cameras, but they made film prints. They've made physical prints.
So Dune 2 is being put through the process I mentioned before, the IMAX DMR process, the digital media remastering process. So, yes, it wasn't shot with the way Nolan shot Oppenheimer in native 1570 IMAX. It was shot digitally. But it's being scanned and up-resed and printed on 1570 film for exhibition in about a little less than half of the theaters that showed Oppenheimer. The reason you had 30 theaters showing Oppenheimer, again, was because you had Nolan behind it, pushing for it. So they got that number up to 30 because of him. Let's face it, that's the truth. Dune 2 is not a Nolan film, so you're only going to see about a dozen prints in the top key markets. San Francisco, L.A., New York, London, Melbourne, okay? Because it doesn't have that Nolan push behind it. Will you continue to see releases of Hollywood movies going forward on film? Yes, provided that it remains successful. It remains to be seen. Are people going to travel out of state to see Dune 2 at a film theater? Are they going to do what they did with Dune 2, the same as they did with Oppenheimer? It remains to be seen. But again, you also have to remember that Oppenheimer was, yes, a Hollywood film, but based on a true historical event and a true man, a real person. Dune is a fictitious story. that might play into it somewhat.
I think we'll see. I think it's really exciting. But I mean, it comes down to Christopher Nolan has, I mean, Jay and I were speaking about this today. We were just talking about how Christopher Nolan has gone tenfold in all of his marketing. Like he's doing way more press. I mean, he's doing skits to like promote his movie, promote stuff. And I think more now than ever, I think he's always done press, but we're at a stage where he realizes the importance of his reputation, his status. And I commend him for really putting himself forefront. Because he seems like a very introverted individual, but him putting himself in the front line, advocating for the medium, advocating for film and storytelling. You know, he was doing TikToks about IMAX and breaking down the science of it and the mechanics.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
And again, that's why what I referred to before is the Great Awakening in the public of what 1570 and the IMAX experience was from the beginning in the late 70s. You know, I did a video one time where, I had many interviews, but I explained to them that the way you are seeing IMAX 2D 1570 now, I'm talking about a film that was shot on an IMAX 2D camera, projected in the 1570 system. Oppenheimer, the same. Going back to with To Fly in 76. So one of my favorite mottos is, just because something is new or the latest technology does not necessarily mean that it is better than what came before it.
Amen.
And I haven't said that phrase in a long time, but I believe in that because, I mean, you can apply that to a lot of different things in film.
I agree.
Everybody knows, for example, in the appliance world, that the washing machines that you bought in the 70s and 80s would last you 50 years. Not so now. You buy your major appliance at your big box retailer, you're lucky if it lasts you for 2 or 3 years. And that plays into cheaper production and everything like that, and planned obsolescence and all these other things. But
I think the last thing I want to go over, and that is, I think the more emotional part of your journey is when the IMAX came to a close. Henry Ford decided they no longer wanted to. They actually canceled their contract early with IMAX.
They negotiated an early exit, yes, and they just wanted to go off and become their own brand and do their own different programming from what they were doing before.
But I think,
like I said, a lot of other theaters did that too. But for me personally, it was difficult period because here I babied this system all those years and it was being taken away from me. It's like, again, if you have, like, say you have a 57 T-Bird and somebody takes it away from you, says, no, you got to buy, now here's your electric car.
People don't understand the emotional detachment because they don't know how much effort went into, keeping that machine alive.
They didn't then. And like I said, they're starting to more so now because of this notoriety and success of Oppenheimer. And you get projectionists putting these videos out there and the audience applauding. And like when we went to see Oppenheimer, you remember
people applauded.
The usher, I think it was not the usher, it was the theater manager, who did a little speech before the show and said, the guys in the booth have been working day and night getting this ready for you, and so give them a round of applause kind of thing. And I got that. I used to get that a little bit, but it just wasn't widely appreciated
because now it's rare.
It's more rare, exactly, because now it's more rare. But you mentioned a bit ago about when you stepped in the booth in Indianapolis and you got this sense of the projector being alive. And that is so true because I worked with the system since it was new. I was with it till the day it went in until the day it was put out. And if it was having a bad day, could sense it, because if it wasn't making a right sound, or something sounded funny, or gauges were giving me funky readings or something like that, I could usually sense that something was going wrong before it actually went wrong. And in so doing, I could fix it before it became a larger problem. People ask me two things. What do you mean that projections are alive? Well, look at a steam locomotive. When you see, if you ever get the opportunity to see a steam locomotive in person, it's a living, breathing thing.
It breathes, yeah.
Compared to, for example, a diesel locomotive. And the engineers in the steam locomotive are feeding the coal and the boiler, and it's just a whole different thing. That's how the IMAX film system was. The other analogy is, somebody asked me, well, they asked me a lot, but in the last 7 years of my career, but what was it like going from being a film projectionist, an analog film projectionist, to a digital cinema operator?
Which is how you ended your projection career.
Or a digital cinema operator, in my mind, the term projectionist would apply to anybody who operates a movie projector. I don't care what kind of movie projector. It can be Super 8 projector, a 16, 35, IMAX, digital, whatever. Projectionist is someone, if you look up the term in the dictionary, it says someone who operates a projector. But what was it like going from an analog film projectionist to a digital projectionist or digital cinema operator? The aesthetic is gone. The hands-on nature of it is gone. You're not doing the physical splicing of the film prints. You're not using your hands and fingers like you used to. You're doing clicks of a mouse, and it's all, digital and computer-based. But the way I drove the point home to people was, okay, pretend you're an artist and you're painting a picture on canvas. You got all your paints and your brushes and your canvas and all your mixing different colors, and all of this done by hand. You're painting a picture on canvas, and all of a sudden somebody takes that all away from you and says, okay, now you got to paint a picture on a computer screen using a mouse across a mouse pad and clicking on little colors and filling it, That's the best way I could describe it.
That's a very different thing.
It's like the hands-on, the physicality of it is gone. What is the same, though, is the showmanship aspects of the presentation. So whether you're talking about film projection or digital projection, you still got to make sure your light is right. Your focus is right, and your sound, and all of that. And because a lot of these digital systems are so automated, the theater chains don't have anybody up there anymore. There's just nobody up there to look over it.
We don't know what we lost.
And when something goes wrong, there's nobody up there to fix it. Or the audience is sitting in silence and watching a film, and there's something wrong, and they don't realize it.
Which, again, I want to tether this back. When you ran the Henry Ford, you had a team. And there was a magazine that was released that referred to you guys as a band of brothers, something akin to like a military, squadron or something.
Yeah.
That's how
a unit,
a military unit. That's how close the bond was between you and those guys. And you trained a lot of people, but you had a team you worked with and you managed. And I guess, people don't know. People don't know that when the Henry Ford, concluded their IMAX chapter, that whole team of people, that whole unit was disbanded.
Yeah, we all went our separate ways. Yeah,
and that team of people were responsible for all the wonderful films, all the peaks, all the blockbusters that came through, the Christopher Nolan mega hits like Interstellar and so forth. All those films, the Harry Potters, the Batmans, those films were showcased, but they weren't done through a corporate entity trying to make profit. It was a group of people who were hyper passionate, incredibly skilled, and technically proficient with a system that was a marvel of mechanical ingenuity. and that person was you and your team, and you guys did that. You were single-handedly, I think the best thing you ever said to me, Ron, was the film projectionist is the last person to touch the movie. And
Final link in the chain.
the final link in the chain. And you guys get not one bad show. You know, you did that for 16 years. And I don't think anyone ever thanked you for your service. I will, for what it's worth. And no, never got to enjoy it. But your friendship has been enlightening, and it's definitely given me so much more. There's so much more perspective and appreciation for the work that I'm passionate about, and that's filmmaking.
Yeah, and you as a filmmaker can appreciate that all the blood, sweat, and tears that you put into a film, which is your baby, and the time comes eventually when you have to let it go and pass it off to somebody else who is responsible for bringing it to the audience, you know, in the way it should be done. And that is the role of the projectionist, digital cinema operator, whatever you want to talk. It's the role of the person upstairs putting on the show for the audience, whatever title you want to give them, okay? And that's a very serious thing. I mean, you know, especially when you're talking about the time it takes to make a feature, I don't know, documentaries, any film, the time that it takes to make a film and the costs involved, the number of people involved. I mean, a lot of people, when they sit through a film, you know, they leave before the credits start. Or if they sit there, they're not really paying attention to the credits. But you look at all those hundreds and hundreds of names coming across the screen who all had a role that brought that film to the audience. But you don't see projectionists in those credits ever. But when I was trained, that is a concept that was instilled upon me, this final link in the chain concept, where, you know, the first link in the chain is the director or the producer, whatever, and then the last link is the last guy to take that project and bring it to life on screen in a theater setting. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people just didn't take that to heart, I guess. But there's still a lot of guys that do. You know, the guys that are out there still, there's not that many of them anymore. But again, and this is also a skill that is passed on from one good person to another. People ask me all the time, where did you learn this? Where did you learn it? Well, a lot of it was self-taught over the years, but I had good teachers too. I was fortunate. But it's a trade skill that is passed on from generation to generation, except now the older generations are getting out of it, and there's nobody left to pass on those new skills. So I was incredibly fortunate to be able to pass on what I knew to you in a digital setting. You know, wish I could have worked with you on film projecting. You've heard me say that a million times, but it's a dying, lost art, to be sure. And yeah, but I think as long as there's still directors that embrace film and there's still an audience for it, albeit a niche audience that demand it and want it, just like, you know, you can still buy film to shoot on your own personal cameras at home. You just got to look a lot harder for it. As long as there is a reasonable demand for it, it's not going to go anywhere.
I think that's a wonderful place for us to end this. I think that's a wonderful point. Ron, we've covered so much ground, and I can't thank you enough for your time and your wisdom.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
And I think more than all, I can't thank you enough for your friendship.
Same here, dude. Thank you.
It was a pleasure to having you, sir.
Thank you.
And thank you for the goodies.
You're welcome.
So, guys, yeah, that was our IMAX deep dive just in time for the release of Dune 2. And hopefully, you know, the bell has not been rung and IMAX's journey isn't over. So thank you for listening to Let's Talk Motion Picture. This podcast is brought to you by Motion Picture Institute, a film school located in Troy, Michigan. If you'd like to know more about our extensive one-year filmmaking program, please check out the website at motionpicture.edu and schedule a tour today.